What's up y'all, Jmaculate here. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the effects section of the Sonicware Lofi-12 XT. Normally I use the SP404 Mark II and its resampling capabilities to shape sounds, but the Lofi-12 has more than 20 effects right out of the box, and I'm curious to see how they can be leveraged to beef up drum sounds. I plan on doing a separate video where I talk about how to use effects for melodic samples or sample chops, but the focus of this video is just going to be enhancing the sonics of the rhythm section using the Lofi-12 effects. Alright, let's get to it. I've loaded up some drum sounds on my 1010 black box to use for my kit. Let's get those recorded into the Lofi-12. Now that all the samples are in the Lofi-12, I'm going to arrange a basic pattern before adding effects. This will help me shape the drums together to unify their sound. And we're done here. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Just kidding. So let's talk about the effects. There are a few ways to set up effects on the Lofi-12 XT. The first way would be to use the EFX page. So from here you can select one of 22 different effects, and the effect will apply to all sounds that are triggered on that track, whether it's sample chops or you're triggering additional samples, or if it's just the one sample that you're using on that track. And each track can have its own effect, and the effects operate independently. So an effect on one track isn't going to impact an effect set on another track. So essentially you can have up to 8 distinct insert effects on your projects on the Lofi-12. Next, there's the FLT page. This allows you to select one of 6 filters as of firmware 1.2, which will be applied to all sounds that are triggered from the track. And these don't take up your one effect per track slot. The filters operate independently from the effects, so you could add a low pass filter to a track, then add a compression effect to really beef up the sound. And finally, there's the RVB page, which allows you to add reverb and delay to any of your tracks. This is controlled from the amp screen. And like with the filter, this is not going to take up your one effect per track slot as it would with the EFX page. So which effect should you use? That all depends on the sounds you're using and what you're trying to accomplish. For this video, we're working on a boom bap drum pattern, so I want the kick to sound heavy, the snare to cut through the mix, and the hi-hats to have low volume so they add a subtle groove to the back end. And the perk sounds I'm using, the hand drum and the shaker, I want to do something similar to the hi-hat, keep them low, subtle, so they can add variety. Alright, let's start adding some effects. We'll start with the snare. With the snare track selected, press the EFX button to access the effects screen. I want to give this snare a bit of a stronger smack sound, so I'm going to use the low and high EQ and boost the highs to help the snare cut through the mix. Here's what the knobs do on this effect. A controls low frequency, the band that will be boosted or cut by the low gain parameter. B controls high frequency, the band that will be boosted or cut by the high gain parameter. C controls low gain, how much the low frequency you specified with the A knob will be boosted or cut. And then D controls high gain, how much the high frequency you specified with the B knob will be boosted or cut. I'm also going to add reverb to the snare to give it a bit more presence. To add reverb to a track, you can navigate to the amp page, then press the leftmost button beneath the screen to get to the send parameter page. By default, both reverb and delay will be set to 0. A small adjustment can have a big impact here, so I start with the number close to 20. This parameter is only controlling a wet-dry balance, so to modify the shape of the reverb, you need to go to the RVB page. From here, select reverb by pressing the rightmost button beneath the screen. The pre-delay is doubling the sound, so I bring that down. Then I go back to the send parameter page from the amp screen to adjust the balance. I'm pleased with the sound, so I won't adjust the reverb parameters any further. Next is the kick. For this sound, I'm going to use a combination of the low pass filter to trim off the high end and the rack compression effect to give the kick a louder sound. Let's start with the filter. This kick has a lot of bright tones, so I'll trim off those frequencies with a low pass filter. I keep the resonance at 0 or 1 and move the frequency of the filter lower with the A knob until I've got the sound close to what I want. Now let's go to the EFX page. To make the kick louder, I'm going to use the rack compression effect. I'm not an expert when it comes to compression, and I find it difficult to explain what the A and B knobs do. I would expect attack to delay the triggering of the compressor, but turning this knob with the threshold in the middle and the ratio cranked up didn't slow the time it took for the gain to kick in. Same with release. This I would expect to let off the compression or reduce the gain after a certain amount of time has passed as the knob is increased, but I couldn't notice it doing that. Basically what I discovered playing around with the settings is that the sound gets pretty loud when you set the attack high, 100 and up, keep the release low, less than 50, then play around with the values of the ratio and threshold being above the halfway point, 63. Now let's work with the hi-hat. One effect that I love using on hi-hats is bit crusher. I find that adding a slight bit crush effect to a high frequency sound like a hi-hat can tame the resonance of those higher frequencies and add a lot of warmth. This helps bury the hi-hat in the mix a bit, keeping it low and subtle. The bit crush effect on the Lofi-12 is called crusher. Here's what the knobs do on this effect. The A knob controls the rate. This emulates the sampling frequency rate, like 11 kHz, 24 kHz, etc. The lower you make this, the lower the sampling rate will be, and therefore, the more compressed the sound will be. B controls the bit rate. This emulates the sample bit rate, like 8-bit, 12-bit, things like that. As you lower this, the sound will become compressed and distorted. It'll have a characteristic of coming from an old video game console or computer program. C controls cutoff. This is a low-pass filter. Setting it to 127 means that no frequencies are cut off, and setting it to 0 means all but the lowest frequencies are cut off. D controls balance, how much of the wet signal versus how much of the dry signal you hear. 127 is hearing only the wet signal, and 0 is hearing only the dry signal. For hi-hats, I recommend setting the rate, bit rate, and balance to the max, 127. Then set the C knob, which is cut off, to 100 or 90 to trim off a little of the high end. After that, experiment with decreasing the bit rate and rate values with the A and B knobs until you have a nice dirty sound. You could even bring it to a point where it sounds too muddy, then reduce the balance by using the D knob by 20 or 30 to bring back a little of the original sound. Now we'll work with the perks. First up is the shaker. I want to add delay to this, but before that, I'm going to chop the sample so that the echoed sounds from the delay are shorter, which can help shape the rhythm and groove. To further shape the sound, I'll use a filter. I ended up going with a simple high-pass filter. Now let's add some delay. There are actually two ways to add delay to sounds on this unit. One is through a delay send, which you can add to individual tracks from the send page of the amp screen, the same place where we added reverb to the snare. And the other way is through an effect on the EFX page called in delay, which is what I'll do for this example. Here's what the knobs do on this effect. A controls time. This is only active if you have the C knob, BPM sync, set to off. Basically, it allows you to have the echoes of the sound come in at intervals that are not synced with the BPM. B controls feedback, how strong the echo effect is. Setting this higher will increase the number of echoes, and setting it lower will decrease the number of echoes. The C knob is for BPM sync. This controls at what intervals the echoes will come in, and as the name implies, it's synced with the tempo of your pattern. Increasing this value by moving the knob to the right causes the echoes to appear more quickly, like every 4th step when set to 1/4, or every 16th step when set to 1/16. The D knob controls the balance, how much of the wet signal you hear versus how much of the dry signal. 127 is only the wet signal, and 0 is only the dry signal. Okay, last up is the hand drum sound. I wasn't sure exactly what effect to use for this sound, so I decided to experiment with the tilt filter effect. Here's what the knobs do on this effect. A controls the cutoff. Having it set to 0 basically plays the dry sound, then having it set to 127 makes the sound tinny, but not to the degree that a maxed out high pass filter would impact the sound. The low frequencies are still there. B controls balance. Adjusting this parameter will shift the amount of the wet signal you hear, but I wouldn't call it a true balance because even set at 0, you can still hear the wet signal. Okay, now let's listen to the arrangement with all the effects turned off so we can compare it to the same pattern but with all the effects turned on. And here's how it sounds with all the effects turned on. As you can see, the Lofi-12 XT gives you incredible control over the shape of your sounds. You can add effects using the EFX section, or you can use that in conjunction with a filter from the FLT page or reverb from the RVB page to have a ton of options when it comes to your sounds and your arrangement. And this video just went over one use case, adding effects to drums. But like I mentioned in the intro, I plan on doing another video talking about adding effects to melodic sounds and samples. Well, that does it for this video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.